Hello again. It's always a pleasure to introduce Alan Taylor, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in History at the University of Virginia. But it's also always a challenge. I mean, where do I start? The winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes and the author of some 11 path-breaking books, Alan has not only reframed the way that scholars view early America, his work has captured the attention of non-academics. His interests have ranged widely, from New England's backcountry to the northern borderlands to slavery and war. His extraordinary 3-volume series, American Colonies, American Revolutions, American Republics, testifies both to Alan's gifts as a writer and to his stunning intellectual ambition and the capacity to realize that ambition on the printed page. And of course, Alan's recent book, Thomas Jefferson's Education, helps us to understand the role of slavery in Jefferson's world and in the university that Jefferson worked so hard to create, a world that this panel will help illuminate. Thank you. Alan.
Thank you, Kathy. After that introduction, does this work? Yeah. Okay, and I can also operate a microphone. I thought by moderating the session, not really, I thought by moderating the session I wouldn't be introduced, but thank you, Kathy, that's very kind. Before I do introduce our panelists, I just want to do something subversive. I want to work the Federalists into a panel on Thomas Jefferson, because I actually got to know Barbara first in a major way when she was the editor, along with Daron Benatar, of a wonderful collection on reconsidering the Federalists. And I think it is a model collection of essays because it came at just the right moment where there was a certain critical mass of scholarship that was saying, you know, there's something more to the Federalists than their being cranky conservative elitists. And it has, I think, had an impact, and it is endured in a way that not a lot of books do over time. And so if you haven't had occasion to see what Daron and Barbara did in that collection, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. So I'm going to introduce all 3 panelists. They are all going to have an opportunity to make some introductory comments. And then I'm going to pose a few questions, depending on our time. And we're going to do our very best to reserve at least the last third of our session for your responses and thoughts. So I begin with, immediately to my right is Jim Ambusky. He's a historian and senior producer at R2 Studios, which is based at George Mason University. He's a historian of the American Revolution, of Scotland, and the British Atlantic world in the 18th century. He got his doctorate at the University of Virginia, and is the author or co-author of several essays and other pieces on the Revolution and King George III and transatlantic legal history. He's currently working on a book entitled The Fury of Emigration, Scotland, the American Revolution, and the Fate of Empire. He's also executive producer of the Green Tunnel podcast, a series about the history of the Appalachian Trail. And he is the creator, host, and lead writer of Worlds Turned Upside Down, another podcast, this one about the history of the American Revolution. Before joining R2 Studios, Jim led the Center for Digital History at the Washington Library at George Washington's Mount Vernon. To his right is Alyssa Pennick, and she is a scholar of early American law, religion, and social history. She completed her doctorate at the University of Michigan, and she's currently a postdoctoral fellow at UVA. Her forthcoming book, American Reformation, Church, State, and Property in the Revolutionary Chesapeake, offers a new legal history of the Anglican religious establishment and its downfall. To farthest to the right is Jeff Looney. And Jeff Looney is the author or editor of several works on the history of Princeton University, and he did his doctoral work there in British history. He's been recovering from that by focusing his career on our founding Anglophobe, Thomas Jefferson. He wanted me to be sure to let you know that he has spent 35 years on Jefferson, 12 at Princeton, and 23 at Monticello, where he is the founding editor-in-chief of the Jefferson Papers Retirement Series. This has produced 19 volumes so far, and a 20th is in press. And for his accomplishments, he's been honored as a past president of the Association for Documentary Editing. We'll begin with Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me today. I was really quite shocked when I got an email from Kathy Kelly inviting me to do this, and so I feel like the odd man out, but I'll do my best here. But it's delighted to be here to celebrate Barbara, and I want to actually start with a little bit of a story as I get into Barbara Oberg's Thomas Jefferson and some thoughts about her career. In 2017, I was invited to attend the premiere of a BBC documentary called The Genius of the Mad King, which was about King George III, which was a product of the Georgian Papers program, who many of you will probably know is an initiative to digitize the papers of the Georgian kings and their families as held in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. And at that premiere in Washington, D.C., lo and behold, I somehow ended up sitting next to Barbara, who will probably not remember this, but I sure do, because during the Q&A, I asked Karen Wolf a question about the future prospects of a documentary edition of George III's papers that would supersede that of Sir John Fortescue in the 1920s. And Barbara whispered to me that that was a, quote, good and important question. Having thus reached the pinnacle of my career in that moment, I decided to retire as a historian and move on to other endeavors. But in all seriousness, that moment has stayed with me through the course of my career, and I would argue that in many ways, Barbara's understanding of Jefferson is reflected in the spirit of that exchange. As we've been hearing a lot about today, she is both a historian and a documentary editor, and those two worlds inform her perceptions of Franklin and her perceptions of Jefferson. And in the case of Jefferson, I think one of the most important contributions she has made is to help us understand this often confounding father, is to insist that we resist the temptation to succumb to his literary and intellectual siren song. As she argued in her 2001 presidential address to the Society for Textual Scholarship, we must not become complacent in our reading of Jefferson as if his words simply slipped off his tongue or the pen. And indeed, we must take care to understand that every word was precisely chosen and often revised by Jefferson again and again and again, reflecting, I think, both his engagement with history, the world of ideas, and his, at times, textual pragmatic approach to implementing his Republican vision for an empire of liberty. As importantly, she admonished us to contextualize those words if we are to understand what motivated Jefferson's actions, his mind, and as Peter Onuf would urge us, his heart. This is even more important as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, as we begin to write new histories of the founding era, at what it meant for not just people like Jefferson, but as we heard this morning from distinguished panelists, what it meant for all people and the experiences they went through and reckoned with. I've tried to keep this charge, Barbara's, at the forefront of my mind as I've struggled to understand Jefferson in a few different contexts, but mainly in his relationship to the law and in his 5-decade one-sided argument with George III about his failure to behave as a proper imperial father. And in 2019, my colleague Randy Flaherty and I were very fortunate to contribute an essay to an edited volume that looked at Jefferson's vision for legal education at the University of Virginia. And in that piece, we argued that Jefferson's reverence for the English common law as articulated by Sir Edward Coke in the 17th century informed Jefferson's belief about the relationship between power and authority and how that authority should be exercised over a populace. For those who have not heard of Sir Edward Coke and his cookbook before, he was Attorney General under Elizabeth I and later Chief Justice of King's Bench and Common Pleas. His honoring of Coke also informed Jefferson's perception of conservative British jurists like Sir William Blackstone and Chief Justice Lord Mansfield, believing that these two men had corrupted English common law, they had strengthened the prerogative, the Crown's prerogative and government authority overall, and that they had reinforced the connection between church and state. And during the War of 1812, when pro-British sentiment in the United States in part convinces Jefferson that Blackstone and Mansfield's seductive legal reasoning had infected American lawyers, and thus they constituted a potential counter-revolution to all of the world that he had helped to build in the post-war period. That they had been transformed into Tories even if they didn't know it, and were, in one sense, an internal enemy waiting to strike and end the Republican experiment. And so a decade later, when he designs the legal curriculum at the University of Virginia, he does so to preach the majesty of Sir Edward Coke's law, Sir Edward Coke's common law, while giving Virginians and the Republic's future leaders the tools to recognize Blackstone's and Mansfield's heresies. But what I found particularly fascinating as I worked on this project with Randy was the way that Jefferson writes about George III. And it didn't make sense to include this argument in the chapter that we wrote, but Jefferson, I find, writes about George III with a kind of seething anger. And I'm still struggling to understand the nature of that anger. But I think, just as Barbara has argued that the specter of Jefferson's failures as a wartime governor haunts his early drafts of his first inaugural address, I would also argue that Jefferson's disappointment in George III's failure to bind up the empire's wounds haunts many of his legal writings. From his exasperated plea in the 1774 Summary Review of the Rights of British America, in which he beseeches the king to open his breast to liberal and expanded thought, through a legal indictment in the form of the Declaration of Independence, and into the 19th century when he sought to purge American law of legal decisions issued during George III's reign. And one concrete example of this is in June 1812, in a letter to Judge John Tyler, father of the future president. Jefferson had recently won a lawsuit filed against him in federal district court over some property in the Louisiana territory. And Judge Tyler wanted to know what Jefferson thought about Chief Justice John Marshall's willingness to rely on English case law in rendering a judgment in Jefferson's favor. John Marshall, of course, was not Jefferson's favorite person. But despite this victory, Jefferson wins. Jefferson doubts the propriety of relying on English authorities since, quote, the ascension of that king whose reign was that very tissues of wrongs which rendered the declaration at length necessary. So notice the precisely chosen words here. That king, not George III, essentially the equivalent of he who shall not be named. And at length necessary, implying that the declaration was not self-evident, it was not desired, it was not wanted, but it had become necessary because of that king. And when George III dies in 1820, Jefferson blamed ongoing tensions in Anglo-American relations on the late king's, quote, obstinate and unforgiving temper. Now, even though, right, by 1820, George III had been incapacitated by mental illness for a decade at this point. So this is not to suggest, of course, that Jefferson had second thoughts about the necessity of the revolution, although, as we know, he is increasingly fearful for its outcome in his old age. But it is to say that as much as Jefferson's emergence as an apostle of American republicanism and for revolution is critical to our understanding of the early republic and his political worldview, perhaps we should also listen to what Jefferson is trying to tell us about his own struggle to unbecome British, to borrow a phrase from Professor Yokota, and his lament in an early draft of the Declaration that British and American subjects might have been, quote, a free and great people together. So thank you very much, and congratulations, Barbara. Appreciate all your work.
Thank you to everyone who's spoken today, and to the organizers for this wonderful celebration. Barbara, we've never met, but my name is Alyssa Pennick, and I can tell you that your essay in Thomas Jefferson's Lives, the introduction, was a breakthrough moment for me when finishing my dissertation. I was the end of the sort of project, and I was so frustrated about Jefferson and why I couldn't figure him out. And reading your essay was a gift because it let me know you spent a long time trying to figure him out, and you still can't. Not totally. None of us can. And as you wrote there, Jefferson is a man who defies easy expectations. And it's better to think of him as having multiple real lives. So that was a gift to me as a frustrated, almost finished graduate student. And it's wisdom I've taken with me as I've moved forward. So thank you. And I really do think that it is a keen editorial eye that allows us to treat Jefferson as somebody with a multiplicity of lives. It takes the intimate knowledge, the everydayness, sort of the nitty-gritty, alongside the comprehensive bird's eye view, the full context. And having those two woven together in your expertise, I think, to even try to get a handle on someone like Jefferson. And in that essay, you really help us think through not just how scholars have defined Jefferson, but he himself started us on that path of trying to figure him out. And I think, again, it's the editorial perspective, what was left out when and why, that can really help us figure out the historiography and how it's changed, and how we can contribute to it still today. So in my current book project, I try to pick up some of those questions, and many of the other themes and questions that have come up today in the comments. It's a study of church and state, comparing Maryland and Virginia, all that the established church was, and all that it takes to dismantle it. So it's trying to really expand our understanding of this thing we call disestablishment. And this project started, where else, but in the Jefferson Papers, with a document that Jefferson wrote in 1776, his draft resolution for discontinuing the establishment of the Church of England. And in this plan, he briefly sketches about 3 sentences how you can just disestablish the church. But one of the key things he draws attention to are the glebe lands, the farms that are attached to parishes, all of the property treated as appurtenances to those glebe lands, and what's going to happen to them. So with that, Jefferson is signaling to us that religious freedom, disestablishment, is not a question simply of ideology, of ideals, of principles. It's going to be about property, and there are big fights looming. So that's the story that I pick up with Jefferson's plan in my mind, and I think it's no coincidence he was thinking about the glebe lands, having just been in court a few years earlier in a fight about a rector's rights to property. A rector had been accused of drunkenness and many other crimes. So Jefferson the lawyer is on display there. Again, another sign of these many lives that Jefferson had. But following from this initial plan, I trace confiscation of glebes, both, not just both, the land itself, the enslaved people who are appurtenances or legally attached to that land, and what happens to them after the American Revolution. And I follow this story into poorhouses run by counties, into small academies, and as well to the University of Virginia, the seed money of which came from seized glebe lands in Albemarle County. So in the project, I try to trace enslaved people. I have been able to track 75 individuals from only 9 of Virginia's 90 parishes. So I can give you just a small idea of how many, sort of the scale of confiscation, if we think about enslaved people alongside land. And trying again to think about the seizure of human property in the name of religious freedom, and how that works together. And I think in this project, I have been at the intersection of questions that came up today about where documentary evidence meets material culture. Looking at architectural records, looking at burned out churches with cannonballs lodged in it, looking at local histories, looking at church silver, thinking about land, people, silver, and churches as a key part of religious freedom. And again, taking me back to Jefferson the lawyer, who was concerned, in 1776 about what was going to happen to the property at stake. So thinking again about religious freedom in a broad context. And so I think that the conversation today has been so useful thinking about how documentary and sort of archival editing can meet with other types of methodology for an even more comprehensive picture. And thinking about moving forward with all of those skills and all those different expertise really helping us make knowledge more accessible and trying to, again, make our narratives comprehensive and inclusive. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for the chance to speak here. I want to take most of my time to celebrate a partnership between Princeton University and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation on a broad scale, and between, am I not on or am I not close? I got to be closer. All right. I'll say that again a little closer. I want to use this opportunity to celebrate a partnership between Princeton University and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation on a larger scale, and between Barbara Oberg and myself on a more personal scale over the last decades. I'd start with an anecdote from the years BB, before Barbara. I attended a conference on the future of Jeffersonian scholarship in 1993, held at Monticello. And I keenly remember, as a kind of a young Turk, when one of the people in the audience said, you know what we really need more than anything right now is a book on Thomas Jefferson's health and a book on Thomas Jefferson's finances. And I remember as a young guy in the audience thinking, why? That seems very, very specialized and specific. I'm not sure we need that. Even now, we've had very good work in both of those areas, Andrew Burstein and Herb Sloan. There is more to be done on those. But there were two other kind of 800-pound gorillas in the room, and they came up occasionally. One was, in 1993, what are we going to do about this whole thing about Sally Hemings? And I remember somebody saying, they should just dig him up. We've got to get an answer once and for all to this. And my sense was that most of the people in the room thought, if we could just dig him up, we could disprove this thing once and for all. And fortunately, scholarship has moved in a direction where we do think we have an answer, and not the one that person expected. But the other 800-pound gorilla in the room was the pace of work on the Jefferson papers. As had been pointed out, they're 80 years old now. They were 55 years old in 1993. Jefferson is still Secretary of State. 5 years later, Jefferson is still not even vice president, and there's a lot of grumpiness about people realizing that once again, yet another generation is going to die before this thing gets finished. And that's where the Thomas Jefferson Foundation got involved and said, what can we do to get this thing done in somebody's foreseeable lifetime? And the answer it came up with was what I now regard as brilliant, which was to split off half of the remaining work to be done and kind of clone the project that was in Princeton and bring a project down to Monticello so that work could continue in both places, or begin in one, continue in the other, without affecting the quality of the work, but that would greatly increase the pace. And the end result of that was, around that time, the editor resigned, and they brought in Barbara to continue working there, and a year later they brought me down to do the retirement series. It was a great idea in theory. The potential for disaster was also there if personalities didn't work out or institutional competitions loomed, and it was a success. And Barbara was key to that, making that thing a success. She agreed to lots of things that made it work. She agreed to let us bring in a contractor to copy the thousands and thousands of cards in the files up there so we could bring them down and make a database to start things at our end. She agreed, I'm sure with some hesitation, to let us bring down thousands of document folders themselves and make copies and send the copies up so we could get our work started. She provided initial crucial advice that enabled us to figure things out and get started, and then at the right time pretty much left us alone so she could concentrate on getting Jefferson into the presidency while we were doing what we were doing. And sometimes there were some great individual moments. The one I remember most fondly was when I decided that for the retirement series, we really needed to adopt a more modern system of transcription than the one that had been adopted from the earliest years, which was an older standard where we did things like silently expanding abbreviations and making changes in the punctuation, things like that. And that was great in its time, and the founding editor was a genius, but we made some changes in the discipline. And I came up loaded for bear. I was going to really talk everybody up there into making this crucial change. And I knew it might be a hard fight, but I was gonna take it and win. And I got up there, and Barbara and her colleagues were arranged around a table, and after about 5 minutes, it turned out that they had been loaded for bear to talk me in my project into changing to a more modern transcription style. So what I thought was going to be sort of a 2-day knockout, drag-out fight wound up being about an hour that wound up in a sort of a love fest. And you know that's sort of a tiny symbol of the overall success of this collaboration, which has worked so well. And the result of that was, the original hope was that we could basically double production. In fact, at both ends, we more than doubled production. So the good news about the whole story is that in our first 55 years, we got 35 volumes out. And in the 25 years since then, no, first 55 years, we got 29 volumes out. And in the 25 years since then, we've gotten 35 volumes out. So we've way more than doubled our production. And that was because of this partnership, which I think only became possible with that kind of leadership from Barbara. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm glad to have a chance to say so. Long-term effect we'll talk about a bit further on in terms of where we can go with scholarship now, but I think the point of this from our perspective as editors is that by starting the retirement years and continuing into the presidency, a foreseeable end is now in sight for them to finish. And that means two things. It means other kinds of scholarship become more possible for editors to tackle. But it also, I think, almost guarantees that we're entering, I predict, a golden age of this kind of scholarship, because what I've seen happen with other major editing projects is that even before they finish, but as they get close to finishing, more and more scholarship comes out because of the kind of accessibility our work provides. So thank you, Barbara, for that.
So I want to pick up where Jeff just left off. I haven't heard a lot of predictions that we're going into a golden age. But I do like that notion. And also you're going to have to run with it. I'm more of a pessimist. You also mentioned that in 1993, there was a conference that was thinking about where we're going to head in Jefferson scholarship and scholarship on the so-called age of Jefferson, the early republic. So I'd like to invite all three of you just to reflect on what you have seen happening in scholarship in the last decade, and also where you think there might be fruitful new developments in that scholarship going forward. Alyssa.
I can start. Well, I hope we're going to a golden age. That sounds lovely. I think it's an exciting time. Whether it's a golden age, I think, is yet to be seen. But I'm going to speak specifically to the questions about sort of religious freedom, because I think some really interesting stuff is happening there. In terms of Jefferson's legacy, for a long time, he alone was held up in some ways as the final word, the authority. And there's been a real pushback against that, to really think of sort of decenter Jefferson in some ways. Think about how other states sort of settled the church-state issue. And I'm probably biased, but I want to push back on that. I think Jefferson's voice needs to be one of the loudest in that conversation. And in terms of his many lives, one of them perhaps as one of his most radical, was in this defense of religious freedom. And it's something, of course, he was, it was swept under the rug in 19th century histories that wanted only Christian leadership. But I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that Jefferson remains a part of the conversation, to really think about this as one of his lives, this sort of dedication to religious freedom. So I guess that is what I sort of hope to contribute myself in the future of Jefferson studies. But I do also think, sort of to go back to my earlier comments and things we've been talking about all day, that expanded methodology, particularly digital scholarship and material culture, are going to be crucial moving forward and sort of building more inclusive and more comprehensive and more accessible narratives, and kind of continuing that as a key goal of our history of the early republic. I think someone used the phrase earlier, textbook narratives, and the textbook is where most people get their history. That is where people do their learning, the average person. And so making sure that those textbook narratives remain accessible and inclusive and equitable, and doing that hopefully by having really available top-notch digital scholarship of the built environment. We're obviously right next to a great example of that, where people can come and learn sort of through public history. So I kind of hope, again, that the future of scholarship in the early republic continues to embrace those methodologies and ensure that textbook history in our schools, history in public narratives, draws on all the expertise that the people in this room have helped contribute.
I'll keep with the legal theme for a moment and actually build off some of Alyssa's work and comments by Lauren this morning about the sort of Civil War nature of the American Revolution, which it actually very much was a civil war. And I think one of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about the revolution in American law and the republicanization of American law in the revolutionary moment is that the law functions to adjudicate disputes. It functions to ensure justice, but it also functions as a weapon against your enemies. As Alyssa has talked about, and certainly Lauren in her article on Charleston, is the ways in which both sides in the revolutionary moment are using the law, are using sequestration, using confiscation as weapons against each other to achieve their political and military ends. And Jefferson is part of that tradition, as Alyssa's talked about and others have talked about. And I think we need to think more concretely about the earlier period of Jefferson's life. Jefferson as a lawyer, as David Koenig's got an impressive book coming out very soon about Jefferson as a lawyer, but seeing how the law functions amidst a civil war, and not simply the fact that even though military operations cease in 1783, that war still goes on in the lives of the people who experience it, and how they use the law to either try to reconstruct themselves in its aftermath or were punished by it by being on the wrong side of that law.
In terms of things that have been achieved, happening in the last couple of decades, I think the most important thing in many ways is the digital advances of getting all the volumes online and continuing to get them online as they come out, which I think has had just a huge impact. I remember once trying to figure out how much more use we were getting, especially with things on Founders Online, and the kind of the metric I was using to measure that, I thought would show kind of an order of magnitude more, but I was wrong by at least one and probably a couple of orders of magnitude about how many people are using our work and the ways they're using it, the creative ways they're using it, and I think that's something we can continue to build on going forward. In terms of specific fields in which we've been advancing, certainly from my 1993 story, I think by far the most important work on Jefferson and his time is the work on slavery. And I think that's where a great deal of the best scholarship has been coming from and will probably continue to come. And I guess in terms of things that I know something about going forward, we anticipate finishing the retirement series that I'm working on in several years, and we're kind of looking ahead about what my colleagues and I can do after that. And there's actually still plenty to do in the Jefferson world, even in the world of documentary scholarship. The papers was conceived originally way back in 1940s, in the first volume in 1950, as two series. The first series, which would be the chronological one that went kind of birth to death, and that's basically what we've been working on ever since. The retirement series is still part of that original chronological series. But the plan also included the second series, and we've done so far half a dozen volumes of that, mostly quite a while back, although on Jim McClure and his colleagues' watch, we got the Legal Commonplace book out, which was a real achievement. And Jim and his colleagues have also taken us in a different direction on one of the possible second series volumes by doing the weather records online, purely online, which really made sense because it wouldn't have made much sense as a kind of a print volume. But we're looking ahead and thinking of, we've started now two, if you'll forgive the advertisement, two planning studies for two things that would kind of count as second series volumes. One would definitely be, and that is we're starting to investigate a new online and eventually print edition of Jefferson's architectural drawings. And the other thing we've started working on is what we're calling the digital archive of slavery to freedom at Monticello. And that actually originated as planning a new edition of Jefferson's farm book. But we've gotten a Mellon grant that will enable us over the next 7 years, if all goes well, the new huge increase in that original idea of the farm book is a database with every discrete fact known about every enslaved person at Monticello, which I think will just be revolutionary in our understanding of the workings of Monticello's plantation. But there's others as well, and I think that that's where my hope for the golden age comes in.
Well, that's very persuasive, Jeff. So I'd also like you all to reflect on the place of Jefferson in the broader public and what you see our role as scholars in relationship to that broader public thinking about Jefferson.
I'll go first, since I most recently worked at a so-called Founding Fathers site. And I can tell you about being on the front lines of that kind of work is very difficult because as scholars we have a very nuanced understanding, and even though Jefferson is an extremely complicated fellow, we have a much more nuanced understanding of these individuals than the public does. But for a lot of these places, right, the idea is to in a sense, sell a particular vision that the public wants to hear in order to ensure that people come through the turnstiles. And it's, of course, I have less knowledge of the workings at Monticello, although because of the virtue of ICJS and the profusion of scholarship that has generated over the course of the years, I think many audiences have a very good sense of Jefferson, even if they love him or hate him. But I think as we're thinking about the 250th, it's our responsibility to not give the public what they want to hear, to stick to our training as historians, to scholarship, and to trust audiences that they can handle different interpretations. Because we're not going to win over everybody. That's just the end of it, and we don't need to. But there is a sizable population out there that yearns for knowledge, that yearns for our expertise, that yearns for us to find ways to translate that into more accessible forms that don't mention the word historiography once in a public setting. And so I'm excited about the possibilities because it's a challenging task. I think it's one that we're up to. It's the reason we make podcasts at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, because, as we like to say, we're on a mission to democratize history, but we're not going to pull any punches. And it's important, I think, for all of us, as we're thinking about folks like Jefferson in this moment, that we do the same.
I think I can just second everything you said and applaud the work that you're doing. I think podcasts are one of the most important ways we can try and sell people on how history is interesting. The number of friends I have who would never pick up a history book but would listen to a podcast suggests to me that we need to be doing this kind of scholarship and having really top-notch scholarship as a part of public history. And to that end, I agree with your comments. We can't underestimate our audience. We have to trust that they want the complicated, the messy, the multiplicity. We can all sit here and agree that it's impossible to take Franklin or Jefferson or any person and make them an easy, digestible story. And so I think leading with the complications and the contradiction, the hypocrisy, all of the mystery is actually a way to get people interested. And so I guess I think in trying to reach the public, it's about making it clear we're not doing any kind of hagiography. We're not trying to heroicize or demonize in simple terms. We want to give the complicated full story. So I think heading into the celebrations in 2026, whether there were, just speaking to somebody in the audience about whether it's a celebration or not, how the public is going to view that, leading with the messy, leading with the complex is the way to get people sucked in and hopefully keep them listening and thinking hard.
We live in tough times in terms of the nation being as politicized as it is, and history is very much a big part of that. Monticello is on the front lines of that. Did anybody hear anything I just said? Some people are nodding, so I won't repeat myself, but except just say, yeah, these are very polarized times. History is a big football and all of that. Monticello's on the front lines of that. I'm happy to say I'm not, because my office is well removed from the tours coming through, but it's certainly something I hear about a lot. Monticello and I think the study of Jefferson generally have come a very long way in dealing with, grappling with the complexities and confusions and contradictions and hypocrisies about Jefferson. And if you were doing our job right, that's what we should be doing. I take some comfort in the fact that Monticello has moved from being legitimately criticized for being too defensive of Jefferson to now being attacked on both sides for being too defensive by some people and being not defensive enough in others. And I think if we continue being attacked that way, we are doing our job. And frankly, I think that's true for historians of it too, is if you are making too many people on one end of it happy, you're probably not doing your job right. I don't know if I can say more than that. So.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up, and we'd all welcome your thoughts and questions. Yes, Joyce.
Thank you. And so a question really kind of about 2026. What is distinctive about the way in which the nation's founders and leaders in the United States have been edited, published, and monumentalized compared with other nations? I mean, is there something distinctively American about this? Or there are similarities in 20th century practice, which is when most of these projects started, and therefore, for all I know, the papers of Winston Churchill are very similar, but maybe not. And I'm wondering where it's not similar. What nations have very different practices, and what does that say as we go into 2026 about what this nation is supposed to be?
That's all you, Jeff.
Well, I can't pretend to say I know a whole lot about how other nations have been doing it, except that when the papers started, the Jefferson papers started, it was certainly a revolutionary a change in approach in America. And I think there were very few other comparable projects in other places. There were kind of two big ideas that Julian Boyd, the first editor, had. One was that he would try to find every text of every document, every copy of every document, not just the one that Jefferson had retained. So if all we had was Jefferson's draft, you wouldn't know how he changed it if you didn't have the one he sent. And that meant that they spent the first years tracking down every known copy of every document all over the world. And that has proven its value again and again as we discover that what went out the door wasn't necessarily the same thing as what he retained. And indeed, with reference to something someone said in the Franklin session, we do have interesting letters that Jefferson wrote and didn't send. In fact, we have letters that Jefferson wrote, and then we've got one where he wrote a fairly long response to somebody, and then he wrote at the bottom of his retained copy, on second thought, I realized I don't know this guy at all. So instead, I sent the following. And the following is a sort of one sentence, thanks for your letter, I liked it. So that is extremely valuable, and it was new. At the time before that, you would just sort of take what papers had been retained in the person's archive. And the other new thing was the inclusion of all the incoming material, all the incoming letters, dealing with all of those. As that first editor said, we include everything legitimately Jeffersonian by reason of authorship or association. And that kind of breadth of enabling you get all the viewpoints. You understand the letters that he wrote because you have the letters he was responding to. Those were new then, and I rather think that that's still comparatively new to how other projects in other countries are doing, although I think some of them are comparable. I could be corrected because I don't know the other fields as well, but that's my impression.
Joyce has a follow-up.
Could I,
Yeah,
could I
because
just pick up
Sure,
before you follow?
sorry.
You know, I know Canada best, and I would have to say you'll be not be surprised to learn that they're much more modest than we are. And that extends to their project about the founders of Confederation. I think there's, among scholars and even in the public, there's a much more of a distancing, a feeling that there's something problematic about the founding of the Confederation, and I think that goes into the more limited public investment in the papers of the founders of Confederation. So I do think that the United States is quite distinctive in the level of investment in a group of people who are identified with the creation of a country. And it makes it very different from any other country. That's my sense of it.
Well, I mean, it is also interesting that university presses in the United States tend to do the publishing, and I'm wondering about countries where it's a state-run operation, possibly, or
Right.
commercial.
Right.
Depending. So I'm not going to be involved in the 2026 things, but I think it's worth thinking about what the monumentalization means and how academics participate in it and what that does say about the United States.
Yeah.
One more. Yes, I'm on here. Just one side comment about that is that I was at Monticello when we were preparing for the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and we learned early on that we would not be calling this a celebration, we would be calling it a commemoration. And the idea is to avoid being too triumphalist about the whole thing, and that's certainly a direction that I personally would think we should be aiming at here as well.
Other questions?
So I have a unique question because of all the panels that we talked today. Full disclosure, I have a toddler. So I'm thinking, how do you get toddlers into this conversation? Is there any research and scholarship on families and, you know, how our founding fathers raised kids, for example?
I'm glad you asked that in one sense. I'm not sure it completely would address that, but I can once again toot our horn just a little bit, and that is that one of the things we did at the retirement series was decide fairly early on that we needed to try to get at the family letters. And by the family letters, I don't mean the letters that Jefferson wrote to his family, which we would always have included, but we decided to go after the letters that Jefferson's, for example, granddaughters wrote to other granddaughters describing what Grandpapa was up to. And we've put more than 1,000 of these online, and we continue adding to it. And some of these have very entertaining and valuable descriptions of what's going on in the extended family at Monticello. How we get that from our nice edited version that you can read online to something that would interest toddlers is not something I'm as clear on, but I certainly think there's a lot that we know and would want to try to convey of that nature.
It's a tough question, and I don't have anything precisely to add about how to engage toddlers. My children are no longer toddlers, and they don't listen to me anyway, so I don't know how to raise kids in general. But I will say, in terms of like scholarship on the folks like Jefferson or Washington, just a sort of a plug for my colleague Cassandra Good, who just published, like last week, a brand new book on George Washington's stepchildren and their lives both at Mount Vernon and their lives in the early 19th century and their complicity and involvement with slavery. And so there's a really good recent example of somebody doing that kind of work in this moment.
Other thoughts and questions? Yes, Holly.
Oh, what the heck, I'll ask it, is you were talking about how don't underestimate the public in what you're doing, is making this calculation that you know what the public should have, that our expertise as historians means we know exactly what should go out there. My question always is, we can put it out there, but are they hearing? Are they receiving it? And so I think at the same point, you're saying don't underestimate it. Do you ever consider the opposite, that you are indeed overestimating what will be received or what will be understood for this?
It's a critical question, and one that we think about all the time, because as good of a story, so there's two components, right? On the one level, it all starts with a story, and it all starts with telling a story well that you believe will engage the public. You have to then define what your publics are. And as we think about our podcast, and of course as we think about writing an essay or a book article, what's the one thing that our editors ask? Well, who's going to read this? So we have to think about that very carefully, and thinking about who our audiences are and how our work fits in or does not fit in with what we think their general perception of a topic is. But then there is sort of that sort of like little Steve Jobs element, like, well, you don't really know what you want, and so we're going to give it to you anyway. But then that's where the marketing comes in. That's where sort of the 1980s Wall Street kind of always be hustling and out there trying to close deals in a completely legal and non-fraudulent way, I should add, so that we can then help folks see that we've got something valuable to offer and help educate them and create opportunities not only for ourselves but for our colleagues to bring their work to bear and expose folks in the public but also in the academy to new ideas and create that conversation amongst them that we can then sort of move those conversations and story forward.
Jump on that also. I think from the perspective of the stakes have never been higher, there is an assumed interest. I was teaching at UVA 2 years ago, I guess, and my students sort of rolled their eyes at one point and they're like, we don't want to hear any more about Jefferson. We're so sick of it. And I was like, oh, a UVA of all places. I wouldn't have expected that. But ultimately, in using the sources right to get them interested, to think about not just the legacies of slavery, but the legacies of their university, the histories of it, and their participation in our democracy, I think especially sort of Gen Z, they recognize the stakes, they get it. So I don't really worry about overestimating them in terms of interest, in terms of recognition of the moment. and how they've, in their own lifetime, their own high school, college careers have seen history as a battleground. They get it. So I don't think, particularly in talking to students, I worry about overestimating them. And I don't exactly know what they want. I think you're right to think I can tell them what I think is important. But again, I think that gets back to the idea of offering multiplicity, of offering complication. And I think particularly students enjoy feeling like they are up to the challenge, like you respect that they can decipher this and interpret it for themselves. So I guess I don't worry about overestimating them, but I do want to kind of take sort of recognition of the fact that they are often waiting for us to meet them where they are, given that the world that they have grown up in.
Yeah, I just had a comment on not underestimating the public too, or our readers, our users. And one is that this was a major kind of factor of our thinking when I went up to have my big argument with Barbara and her colleagues, and it turned out that they were in agreement with me on changing our transcription style to be more reflective of the actual document, because our original rationale back when was that we needed to make it more readable. I mean, that's really the argument for expanding abbreviations and things like that. And we did it with some fear and trembling, I think, at both ends. And in fact, we got no criticisms at all that I was aware of, because people didn't really have a problem with abbreviations and things. But more generally, they wanted what the documents say, and they didn't want to be mediated that way, that wasn't being helpful to them. There's obviously a need sometimes to create a more, kind of a more lower grade educational version for lessons. But what people want from us, I firmly believe, is something as close to the documents as we can get, so that people don't have to go back and look at it themselves if we do our work right. I like to argue that most of our readers aren't born yet. But the other point about that is it's critically important that we use we present these documents in ways that help the current historiographical, political situation. But there's no way at all to predict how people are going to find this stuff interesting or use it later. And we've, again and again, things that weren't thought to be of no importance historical, as we were saying in an earlier session, turn out to be extremely important and interesting. I remember a case where earlier edition of the Letters of John Jay, they calendared a whole bunch of stuff, and they would have a bracketed section saying, "Family Matters." That's it, Family Matters, because that's not what you put in an important edition. Well, we know better, but the only way we're going to avoid having the next generation laughing at a decision we made about what to exclude is to be less sure of ourselves about that. So that's the way a document editor thinks anyway.
Well, Jeff has poured it all on microphones.
I don't know how that happened. I steal pens.
All right. So we've got 1 minute left. Does anyone have a last comment or question, quick question? Yes, please.
I actually wonder, since Hamilton was such a great...
We can't hear you otherwise, so.
Since the Broadway hit Hamilton was such a great success and everybody was so surprised about this, I wonder if anybody has any kind of record as to, how many adults thought it was really good versus children or school children that were taken there. But, it seems that everybody seems to think that this was a very helpful and good thing. But I don't know if anybody knows anything about the statistics involved, and also, is anybody even thinking about trying to repeat that? I mean, Hamilton wasn't the most well-known person amongst the, founders in a way, but somehow it was a smash hit.
Alyssa, go ahead.
Don't have any specific statistics I can speak to, just personal experience. The batch of essays that I get when I ask about the Bank of the United States post Hamilton coming out is so much better because they can all repeat the song verbatim and they understand now why the Bank of the US was not only controversial but so significant. So I think as a tool to capture attention, but also using narrative and song for retention is clearly really important. So I don't have a project to pitch for the next Hamilton, but I hope that there are more like it.
And just for those who didn't see this, a plug, you can find it by Googling. Stephen Colbert, after Hamilton, did a little skit where he got Lin-Manuel Miranda to join him in his new one-song musical called Button, about Button Gwinnett. And if you haven't seen that, you should. So that's the kind of direction we need to go.
Well, we need to end on that note. So thank you all, and please join us in thanking the panel.